Chapter 12 of the Book of Dreams and Ghosts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dan Gurzynski. The Book of Dreams and Ghosts by Andrew Lang. Chapter 12. The Story of Glam. The Foul Fords. The Story of Glam. There was a man named Thorhall, who lived at Thorhallstead in Forsaladala, which lies in the north of Iceland. He was a fairly wealthy man, especially in cattle, so that no one round about had so much livestock as he had. He was not a chief, however, but an honest and worthy yeoman. Now this man's place was greatly haunted, so that he could scarcely get a shepherd to stay with him. And although he asked the opinion of many as to what he ought to do, he could find none to give him advice of any worth. One summer at the Althing, or yearly assembly of the people, Thorhall went to the booth of Skafti, the lawman, who was the wisest of men and gave good counsel when his opinion was asked. He received Thorhall in a friendly way, because he knew he was a man of means, and asked him what news he had. "I would have some good advice from you," said Thorhall. "I am little able to give that," said Skafti, "but what is the matter?" "This is the way of it," said Thorhall. "I have had very bad luck with my shepherds of late. Some of them get injured, and others will not serve out their time, and now no one that knows how the case stands will take the place at all." "Then there must be some evil spirit there," said Skafti, "when men are less willing to herd your sheep than those of others. Now, since you have asked my advice, I will get a shepherd for you. Glam is his name. He belongs to Sweden, and came out here last summer. He is big and strong, but not very well liked by most people." Thorhall said that he did not mind that, if he looked well after the sheep. Skafti answered that there was no hope of other men doing it, if Glam could not, seeing he was so strong and stout-hearted. Their talk ended there, and Thorhall left the booth. This took place just at the breaking up of the assembly. Thorhall missed two of his horses, and went to look for them in person, from which it may be seen that he was no proud man. He went up to the mountain ridge and south along the fell that is called Armin's Fell. There he saw a man coming down from the wood, leading a horse laden with bundles of brushwood. They soon met each other, and Thorhall asked his name. He said he was called Glam. He was tall of body and of strange appearance. His eyes were blue and staring, and his hair wolf-gray in color. Thorhall was a little startled when he saw him, and was certain that this was the man he had been told about. "What work are you best fitted for?" he asked. Glam said that he was good at keeping sheep in winter. "Will you look after my sheep?" said Thorhall. "Skafti has put you into my hands." "On this condition only will I take service with you," said Glam, "that I have my own free will, for I am ill-tempered if anything does not please me." "That will not harm me," said Thorhall, "and I should like you to come to me." "I will do so," said Glam. "But is there any trouble at your place?" "It is believed to be haunted," said Thorhall. "I am not afraid of such bugbears," said Glam, "and think that it'll be all the livelier for that." "You will need all your boldness," said Thorhall. "It is best not to be too frightened for oneself there." After this they made a bargain between them, and Glam was to come when the winter nights began. Then they parted, and Thorhall found his horses where he had just newly looked for them, and rode home after thanking Skafti for his kindness. The summer passed, and Thorhall heard nothing of the shepherd, nor did any one know the least about him. But at the time appointed he came to Thorhallstead. The yeoman received him well, but the others did not like him, and the goodwife least of all. He began his work among the sheep, which gave him little trouble, for he had a loud, hoarse voice, and the flock all ran together whenever he shouted. There was a church at Thorhallstead, but Glam would never go to it, nor join in the service. He was unbelieving, surly, and difficult to deal with, and ever one felt a dislike towards him. So time went on till it came to Christmas Eve. On that morning, Glam rose early and called for his food. The good wife answered, "It is not the custom of Christian people to eat on this day, for tomorrow was the first day of Christmas, and we ought to fast today." Glom replied, "You have many foolish fashions that I see no good in. I cannot see that men are any better off now than they were when they never troubled themselves about such things. I think it was a far better life when men were heathens, and now I want my food, and no nonsense." The good wife answered, "I'm sure you will come to sorrow today if you act thus perversely." Glom bade her bring his food at once, or it would be the worse for her. She was afraid to refuse, and after he had eaten, he went out in a great rage. The weather was very bad. It was dark and gloomy all round. Snowflakes fluttered about. Loud noises were heard in the air, and it grew worse and worse as the day wore on. They heard the shepherd's voice during the forenoon, but less of him as the day passed. Then the snow began to drift, and by evening there was a violent storm. People came to the service in church, and the day wore on to evening, but still Glom did not come home. There was some talk among them of going to look for him, but no search was made on account of the storm and the darkness. All Christmas Eve Glom did not return, and in the morning men went to look for him. They found the sheep scattered in the fens, beaten down by the storm, or upon the hills. Thereafter they came to a place in the valley where the snow was all trampled, as if there had been a terrible struggle there, for stones and frozen earth were torn up all round about. They looked carefully round the place, and found Glom lying a short distance off, quite dead. He was black in color, and swollen up as big as an ox. They were horrified at the sight and shuddered in their hearts. However, they tried to carry him to the church, but could get him no further than to the edge of a cleft, a little lower down, so they left him there and went home and told their master what had happened. Thorhall asked him what had been the cause of Glom's death. They said that they had traced footprints as large as though the bottom of a cask had been set down in the snow, leading from where the trampled place was up to the cliffs at the head of the valley, and all along the track there were huge bloodstains. From this they guessed that the evil spirit which lived there must have killed Glom, but had received so much hurt that it had died, for nothing was ever seen of it after. The second day of Christmas they tried again to bring Glom to the church. They yoked horses to him, but after they had come down the slope and reached level ground, they could drag him no further, and he had to be left there. On the third day, a priest went with them, but Glom was not to be found, although they searched for him all day. The priest refused to go a second time, and the shepherd was found at once when the priest was not present. So they gave over their attempts to take him to the church, and buried him on the spot. Soon after this, they became aware that Glom was not lying quiet, and great damage was done by him, for many that saw him fell into a swoon or lost their reason. Immediately after Yule, men believed that they saw him about the farm itself, and grew terribly frightened, so that many of them ran away. After this, Glom began to ride on the housetop by night, and nearly shook it to pieces, and then he walked about almost night and day. Men hardly dared to go up into the valley, even though they had urgent business there, and every one in the district thought great harm of the matter. In spring, Thorhall got new men, and started the farm again, while Glom's walkings began to grow less frequent as the days grew longer, so time went on until it was midsummer. That summer a ship from Norway came into Hunawater, a firth to the north of Thorhallstead, and had on board a man called Thurgood. He was foreign by birth, big of body, and as strong as any two men. He was unhired and unmarried, and was looking for some employment, as he was penniless. Thorhall rode to the ship and found Thurgood there. He asked him whether he would enter his service. Thurgood answered that he might well do so, and that he did not care much what work he did. "You must know, however," said Thorhall, "that it is not good for any faint-hearted man to live at my place, on account of the hauntings that have been of late, and I do not wish to deceive you in any way." "I do not think myself utterly lost, although I see some wretched ghosts," said Thurgood. It will be no light matter for others if I am scared, and I will not throw up the place on that account." Their bargain was quickly made, and Thurgood was to have charge of the sheep during the winter. The summer went past, and Thurgood began his duties with the winter nights, and was well liked by everyone. Glahn began to come again and rode on the housetop, which Thurgood thought great sport, and said that the thrall would have to come to close quarters before he would be afraid of him. Thorhall bade him not say too much about it. "It will be better for you," said he, "if you have no trial of each other." "Your courage has indeed been shaken out of you," said Thurgood, "but I am not going to fall dead for such talk." The winter went on till Christmas came again, and on Christmas Eve the shepherd went out to his sheep. "I trust," said the good wife, "that things will not go after the old fashion." "Have no fear of that, good wife," said Thurgood. "There will be something worth talking about if I don't come back." The weather was very cold and a heavy drift blowing. Thurgood was in the habit of coming home when it was half dark, but on this occasion he did not return at his usual time. People came to the church, and they now began to think that things were not unlikely to fall out as they had done before. Thorhall wished to make search for the shepherd, but the churchgoers refused, saying that they would not risk themselves in the hands of evil demons by night, and so no search was made. After their morning meal on Christmas Day, they went out to look for the shepherd. They first made their way to Glaham's cairn, guessing that he was the cause of the man's disappearance. On coming near to this, they saw great tidings, for there they found the shepherd with his neck broken and every bone in his body smashed in pieces. They carried him to the church, and he did no harm to any man thereafter. But Glaham began to gather strength anew, and now went so far in his mischief that everyone fled from Thorhallstead, except the yeoman and his wife. The same cattleman, however, had been there for a long time, and Thorhall would not let him leave, because he was so faithful and so careful. He was very old, and did not want to go away either, for he saw that everything his master had would go to rack and ruin, if there was no one to look after it. One morning after the middle of winter, the good wife went out to the byre to milk the cows. It was broad daylight by this time, for no one ventured to be outside earlier than that, except the cattleman, who always went out when it began to grow clear. She heard a great noise and fearful bellowing in the byre, and ran into the house again, crying out and saying that some awful thing was going on there. Thorhall went out to the cattle, and found them goring each other with their horns. To get out of their way, he went through into the barn, and in doing this, he saw the cattleman lying on his back, with his head in one stall and his feet in the other. He went up to him and felt him, and soon found that he was dead, with his back broken over the upright stone between two of the stalls. The yeoman thought it high time to leave the place now, and fled from his farm with all that he could remove. All the livestock that he left behind was killed by Glaham, who then went through the whole glen, and laid waste all the farms up from the tongue. Thorhall spent the rest of the winter with various friends. No one could go up into the glen with horse or dog, for these were killed at once. But when spring came again, and the days began to lengthen, Glaham's walkings grew less frequent, and Thorhall determined to return to his homestead. He had difficulty in getting servants, but managed to set up his home again at Thorhallstead. Things went just as before. When autumn came, the hauntings began again, and now it was the yeoman's daughter who was most assailed, till in the end she died of fright. Many plans were tried, but all to no avail, and it seemed as if all Waterdale would be laid waste unless some remedy could be found. All this befell in the days of Grettir, the son of Asmund, who was the strongest man of his day in Iceland. He had been abroad at this time, outlawed for 3 years, and was only 18 years of age when he returned. He had been at home all through the autumn, but when the winter nights were well advanced, he rode north to Waterdale, and came to Tongue, where lived his uncle Yokel. His uncle received him heartily, and he stayed there for 3 nights. At this time there was so much talk about Glaham's walkings that nothing was so largely spoken of as these. Grettir inquired closely about all that had happened, and Yokel said that the stories told no more than it had indeed taken place. "But are you intending to go there, kinsman?" said he. Grettir answered that he was. Yokel bade him not do so, for it is a dangerous undertaking, and a great risk for your friends to lose you. For in our opinion there is not another like you among the young men, and ill will come of ill, where Glam is. Far better it is to deal with mortal men than with such evil spirits. Grettir, however, said that he had a mind to fare to Thorolstead, and see how things had been going on there. Yokel replied, "I see now that it is of no use to hold you back, but the saying is true that good luck and good heart are not the same." Grettir answered, "Woe stands at one man's door when it has entered another's house. Think how it may go with yourself before the end." "It may be," said Yokel, "that both of us see some way into the future, and yet neither of us can do anything to prevent it." After this they parted, and neither liked the other's forebodings. Grettir rode to Thorolstead, and the yeoman received him heartily. He asked Grettir where he was going, who said that he wished to stay there all night, if he would allow him. Thorhall said he would be very glad if he would stay, but few men count it a gain to be guests here for long. You must have heard how matters stand, and I shall be very unwilling for you to come to any harm on my account. And even though you yourself escape safe and sound, I know for certain that you will lose your horse, for no man that comes here can keep that uninjured." Grettir answered that there were horses enough to be got, whatever might happen to this one. Thorhall was delighted that he was willing to stay, and gave him the heartiest reception. The horse was strongly secured in an outhouse when they went to sleep, and that night passed without Glam appearing. "Your coming here," said Thorhall, "has made a happy change, for Glam is in the habit of riding the house every night, or breaking up the doors, as you may see for yourself." "Then one of two things will happen," said Grettir. "Either he will not restrain himself for long, or the hauntings will cease for more than one night. I shall stay for another night, and see how things go." After this they went to look at Grettir's horse, and found he had not been meddled with. So the yeoman thought that everything was going on well. Grettir stayed another night, and still the thrall did not come about them. Thorhall thought that things were looking brighter, but when he went to look to Grettir's horse, he found the outhouse broken up, the horse dragged outside, and every bone in it broken. He told Grettir what had happened, and advised him to secure his own safety, for your death is certain if you wait for Glam. Grettir answered, "The least I can get for my horse is to see the thrall." Thorhall replied that it would do him no good to see him, for he is unlike anything in human shape, but I am fain of every hour that you were willing to stay here. The day wore on, and when it was bedtime, Grettir would not take off his clothes, but lay down on the floor over against Thorhall's bed-closet. He put a thick cloak about himself, buttoning one end beneath his feet and doubling the other under his head, while he looked out at the hole for the neck. There was a strong plank in front of the floored space, and against this he pressed his feet. The door fittings were all broken off from the outer door, but there was a hurdle set up instead, and roughly secured. The wainscot that had once stretched across the hall was all broken down, both above and below the crossbeam. The beds were all pulled out of their places, and everything was in confusion. A light was left burning in the hall, and when the third part of the night was past, Grettir heard loud noises outside. Then something went up on the top of the house and rode above the hall, beating the roof with its heels, till every beam cracked. This went on for a long time. Then it came down off the house and went to the door. When this was opened, Grettir saw the thrall thrust in his head. Ghastly big he seemed, and wonderfully huge of feature. Glam came in slowly and raised himself up when he was inside the doorway till he loomed up against the roof. Then he turned his face down the hall, laid his arms on the crossbeam, and glared all over the place. Thorhall gave no sign during this, for he thought it bad enough to hear what was going on outside. Grettir lay still and never moved. Glom saw that there was a bundle lying on the floor and moved further up the hall and grasped the cloak firmly. Grettir placed his feet against the plank and yielded not the least. Glom tugged a second time, much harder than before, but still the cloak did not move. A third time he pulled with both his hands, so hard that he raised Grettir up from the floor, and now they wrenched the cloak asunder between them. Glom stood staring at the piece which he held in his hands, and wondering greatly who could have pulled so hard against him. At that moment, Grettir sprang in under the monster's hands and threw his arms around his waist, intending to make him fall backwards. Glom, however, bore down upon him so strongly that Grettir was forced to give way before him. He then tried to stay himself against the seat boards, but these gave way with him, and everything that came in their path was broken. Glom wanted to get him outside, and although Grettir set his feet against everything that he could, yet Glom succeeded in dragging him out into the porch. There they had a fierce struggle, for the thrall meant to have him out of doors, while Grettir saw that bad as it was to deal with Glom inside the house, it would be worse outside, and therefore strove with all his might against being carried out. When they came into the porch, Glom put forth all his strength, and pulled Grettir close to him. When Grettir saw that he could not stay himself, he suddenly changed his plan, and threw himself as hard as he could against the monster's breast, setting both his feet against an earth-fast stone that lay in the doorway. Glom was not prepared for this, being then in the act of pulling Grettir towards him, so he fell backwards and went crashing out through the door, his shoulders catching the lintel as he fell. The roof of the porch was wrenched in two, both rafters and frozen thatch, and backwards out of the house went Glom, with Grettir above him. Outside there was bright moonshine and broken clouds, which sometimes drifted over the moon and sometimes left it clear. At the moment when Glom fell, the cloud passed off the moon, and he cast up his eyes sharply towards it, and Grettir himself said that this was the only sight he ever saw that terrified him. Then Grettir grew so helpless, both by reason of his weariness and at seeing Glom roll his eyes so horribly, that he was unable to draw his dagger and lay well nigh between life and death. But in this was Glom's might more fiendish than that of most other ghosts, that he spoke in this fashion. "Great eagerness have you shown to meet me, Grettir, and little wonder will it be, though you get no great good fortune from me. But this I may tell you, that you have now received only half of the strength and vigor that was destined for you if you had not met with me. I cannot now take from you the strength you have already gained. But this I can see, too, that you will never be stronger than you are now, and yet you are strong enough, as many a man shall feel. Hitherto you have been famous for your deeds, but henceforth you shall be a manslayer and an outlaw, and most of your deeds will turn to your own hurt and misfortune. Outlaw you shall be, and ever have a solitary life for your lot. And this, too, I lay upon you, ever to see these eyes of mine before your own, and then you will think it hard to be alone, and that will bring you to your death." When Glom had said this, the faintness passed off Grettir, and he then drew his dagger, cut off Glom's head, and laid it beside his thigh. Thorhall then came out, having put on his clothes while Glom was talking, but never venturing to come near until he had fallen. He praised God and thanked Grettir for overcoming the unclean spirit. Then they set to work and burned Glom to ashes, which they placed in a sack and buried where cattle were least likely to pasture, or men to tread. When this was done, they went home again, and it was now near daybreak. Thorhall sent to the next farm for the men there and told them what had taken place. All thought highly of the exploit that heard of it, and it was the common talk that in all Iceland there was no man like Grettir Asmundarson, for strength and courage and all kinds of bodily feats. Thorhall gave him a good horse when he went away, as well as a fine suit of clothes, for the ones he had been wearing were all torn to pieces. The two then parted with the utmost friendship. Thence Grettir rode to the ridge in Waterdale, where his kinsman Thorvald received him heartily, and asked closely concerning his encounter with Glom. Grettir told him how he had fared, and said that his strength was never put to harder proof. So long did the struggle between them last. Thorvald bade him be quiet and gentle in his conduct, and things would go well with him, otherwise his troubles would be many. Grettir answered that his temper was not improved. He was more easily roused than ever, and less able to bear opposition. In this, too, he felt a great change, that he had become so much afraid of the dark that he dared not go anywhere alone after night began to fall, for then he saw phantoms and monsters of every kind. So it has become a saying ever since then, when folks see things very different from what they are, that Glom lends them his eyes, or gives them glom sight. This fear of solitude brought Grettir at last to his end. Ghosts being seldom dangerous to human life, we follow up the homicidal Glom with a Scottish traditional story of malevolent and murderous sprites. The Foul Fords, or the Longformacus Farrier. About 1820 there lived a farrier of the name of Keane in the village of Longformacus in Lammermoor. He was a rough, passionate man, much addicted to swearing. For many years he was farrier to the Eagle or Spottiswoode troop of yeomanry. One day he went to Greenlaw to attend the funeral of his sister, intending to be home early in the afternoon. His wife and family were surprised when he did not appear as they expected, and they sat up watching for him. About 2 o'clock in the morning, a heavy weight was heard to fall against the door of the house, and on opening it to see what was the matter, old Keane was discovered lying in a fainting fit on the threshold. He was put to bed and means used for his recovery, but when he came out of the fit he was raving mad and talked of such frightful things that his family were quite terrified. He continued till next day in the same state, but at length his senses returned and he desired to see the minister alone. After a long conversation with him, he called all his family round his bed and required from each of his children and his wife a solemn promise that they would none of them ever pass over a particular spot in the moor between Longformacus and Greenlaw, known by the name of the Foul Fords. It is the ford over a little watercourse just east of Castle Shields. He assigned no reason to them for this demand, but the promise was given and he spoke no more, and died that evening. About 10 years after his death, his eldest son, Henry Keane, had to go to Greenlaw on business, and in the afternoon he prepared to return home. The last person who saw him as he was leaving the town was the blacksmith of Spottiswoode, John Mitchie. He tried to persuade Mitchie to accompany him home, which he refused to do, as it would take him several miles out of his way. Keane begged him most earnestly to go with him, as he said he must pass the Foul Fords that night, and he would rather go through hellfire than do so. Mitchie asked him why he said he must pass the Foul Fords, as by going a few yards on either side of them he might avoid them entirely. He persisted that he must pass them, and Mitchie at last left him, a good deal surprised that he should talk of going over the Foul Fords when everyone knew that he and his family were bound by a promise to their dead father never to go by the place. Next morning a laboring man from Castle Shields, by name Adam Redpath, was going to his work digging sheep drains on the moor, when on the Foul Fords he met Henry Keane lying stone dead, and with no mark of violence on his body. His hat, coat, waistcoat, shoes, and stockings were lying about 100 yards distance from him on the Greenlaw side of the Fords, and while his flannel drawers were off and lying with the rest of his clothes, his trousers were on. Mr. Ord, the minister of Longformacus, told one or two persons what John Keane, the father, had said to him on his deathbed, and by degrees the story got abroad. It was this. Keene said that he was returning home slowly after his sister's funeral, looking on the ground when he was suddenly roused by hearing the tramping of horses, and on looking up he saw a large troop of riders coming towards him 2 and 2. What was his horror when he saw that one of the 2 foremost was the sister whom he had that day seen buried at Greenlaw. On looking further, he saw many relations and friends long before dead. But when the 2 last horses came up to him, he saw that one was mounted by a dark man whose face he had never seen before. He led the other horse, which, though saddled and bridled, was riderless, and on this horse the whole company wanted to compel Keene to get. He struggled violently, he said, for some time, and at last got off by promising that one of his family should go instead of him. There still lives at Longformacus his remaining son Robert. He has the same horror of the foul fords that his brother had, and will not speak, nor allow anyone to speak to him on the subject. 3 or 4 years ago, a herd of the name of Burton was found dead within a short distance of the spot, without any apparent cause for his death. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of the Books of Dreams and Ghosts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Radhika Tamhankar. The Book of Dreams and Ghosts by Andrew Lang. The Marvels at Froda. The following tale has all the direct simplicity and truth to human nature which mark the ancient literature of Iceland. Defoe might have envied the profusion of detail, the large chest with the lock, and the small box, and so on. Some of the minor portents, such as the disturbances among inanimate objects, and the appearance of a glow of mysterious light, the fate moon, recur in modern tales of haunted houses. The combination of Christian exorcism, then a novelty in Iceland, with legal proceedings against the ghosts is especially characteristic. The Marvels at Froda. During that summer in which Christianity was adopted by law in Iceland, 1000 AD, it happened that a ship came to land at Snowfell-Ness. It was a Dublin vessel, manned by Irish and Hebrideans, with few Norsemen on board. They lay there for a long time during the summer, waiting for a favorable wind to sail into the firth, and many people from the Ness went down to trade with them. There was on board a Hebridean woman named Thorgunna, of whom her shipmates said that she owned some costly things, the like of which would be difficult to find in Iceland. When Thurgood, the housewife at Froda, heard of this, she was very curious to see the articles, for she was a woman that was fond of show and finery. She went to the ship and asked Thorgunna whether she had any woman's apparel that was finer than the common. Thorgunna said that she had nothing of the kind to sell, but had some good things of her own, that she might not be affronted at feasts or other gatherings. Thurgood begged a sight of these, and Thorgunna showed her treasures. Thurgood was very much pleased with them, and thought them very becoming, though not of high value. She offered to buy them, but Thorgunna would not sell. Thurgood then invited her to come and stay with her, because she knew that Thorgunna was well provided, and thought that she would get the things from her in course of time. Thorgunna answered, "I am well pleased to go stay with you, but you must know that I have very little mind to pay for myself, because I'm well able to work, and have no dislike to it, though I will not do any dirty work. I must be allowed to settle what I shall pay for myself out of such property as I have." Although Thorgunna spoke in this fashion, yet Thurid would have her to go with her, and her things were taken out of the ship. These were in a large chest with a lock and a small box, and both were taken home to Froda. When Thorgunna arrived there, she asked for her bed to be shown to her, and was given one in the inner part of the hall. Then she opened up the chest and took bedclothes out of it. They were all very beautiful, and over the bed she spread English coverlets and a silken quilt. Out of the chest she also brought a bed curtain and all the hangings that belonged to it, and the whole outfit was so fine that folk thought they had never seen the like of it. Then said Thurid the housewife, "Name the price of all your bedclothes and hangings." Thorgunna answered, "I will not lie among straw for you, although you are so stately and bear yourself so proudly." Thurid was ill pleased at this, and offered no more to buy the things. Thorgunna worked at cloth making every day when there was no hay making, but when the weather was dry, she worked among the dry hay in the home field, and had a rake made for herself, which she alone was to use. Thorgunna was a big woman, both broad and tall, and very stout. She had dark eyebrows, and her eyes were close set, her hair brown and in great abundance. She was well mannered in her daily life, and went to church every day before beginning her work, but she was not of a light disposition, nor of many words. Most people thought that Thorgunna must be in the 60s, yet she was a very active woman. At this time, one Thorir Woodenleg and his wife Thorgrima Charmcheek were being maintained at Froda, and there was little love between them and Thorgunna. The person that she had most ado with was Jartan, the son of the house. Him she loved much, but he was rather cold towards her, and this often vexed her. Jartan was then 15 years old, and was both big of body and manly in appearance. The summer that year was very wet, but in the autumn there came dry days. By this time the hay work at Froda was so far advanced that all the home field was mown, and nearly the half of it was quite dry. There came then a fine dry day, clear and bright, with not a cloud to be seen in the sky. Thorodd, the yeoman, rose early in the morning and arranged the work of each one. Some began to cart off the hay, and some to put it into stocks, while the women were set to toss and dry it. Thorgunna also had her share assigned to her, and the work went on well during the day. When it drew near to 3 in the afternoon, a mass of dark clouds was seen rising in the north, which came rapidly across the sky and took its course right above the farm. They thought it certain that there was rain in the cloud, and Thorodd bade his people rake the hay together. But Thorgunna continued to scatter hers, in spite of the orders that were given. The clouds came on quickly, and when they were above the homestead at Froda, there came such darkness with them that the people could see nothing beyond the home field. Indeed, they could scarcely distinguish their own hands. Out of the cloud came so much rain that all the hay which was lying flat was quite soaked. When the cloud had passed over and the sky cleared again, it was seen that blood had fallen amid the rain. In the evening there was a good draught, and the blood soon dried off all the hay except that which Thorgunna had been working at. It did not dry, nor did the rake that she had been using. Thurid asked Thorgunna what she supposed this marvel might portend. She said that she didn't know, but it seems to me most likely that it is an evil omen for some person who is present here. In the evening Thorgunna went home and took off her clothes, which had been stained with the blood. Then she lay down in her bed and breathed heavily, and it was found that she was taken with sickness. The shower had not fallen anywhere else than at Froda. That evening Thorgunna would taste no food. In the morning Thorodd came to her and asked about her sickness and what end she thought it would have. She answered that she did not expect to have any more illnesses. Then she said, "I consider you the wisest person in the homestead here, and so I shall tell you what arrangements I wish to make about the property that I leave behind me, and about myself, for things will go as I tell you, though you think there is nothing very remarkable about me. It will do you little good to depart from my instructions, for this affair has so begun that it will not pass smoothly off unless strong measures are taken in dealing with it." The rod answered, "There seems to me great likelihood that your forebodings will come true, and therefore," said he, "I shall promise to you not to depart from your instructions." "These are my arrangements," said Thorgunna, "that I will have myself taken to Skullholt, for my mind forebodes me that that place will some time or other be the most glorious spot in this land. I know also that by now there are priests there to sing the funeral service over me. So I ask you to have me carried thither, and for that you shall take so much of my property that you suffer no loss in the matter. Of my other effects, Thurid shall have the scarlet cloak that I own, and I give it to her so that she may readily consent to my disposing of the rest as I please. I have a gold ring, and it shall go to the church with me. But as for my bed and bed hangings, I will have them burned with fire, because they will be of service to no one. I do not say this because I grudge that anyone should possess these treasures, if I knew that they would be of use to them. Rather am I so earnest in this matter because I should be sorry for folk to fall into such trouble for me, as I know will be the case if my words are not heeded." The rod promised to do as she asked him, and after this Thorgunna's sickness increased, so that she lay but few days before she died. The body was first taken to the church, and Thorod had a coffin made for it. On the following day Thorod had all the bedclothes carried out into the open air and made a pile of wood beside them. Then Thurid the housewife came up and asked what he was going to do with the bedclothes. He answered that he was to burn them with fire, as Thorgunna had directed him. "I will not have such treasures burned," said Thurid. The rod answered, she declared strongly that it would not do to depart from what she said. "That was mere jealousy," said Thurid. "She grudged any other person the use of them, and that was why she gave these orders. But nothing terrible will happen though her words were set aside. I doubt," said he, "whether it will be well to do otherwise than as she charged me." Then Thurid laid her arms round his neck, and besought him not to burn the furnishings of the bed, and so much did he press him in this, that his heart gave way to her, and she managed it so that Thorod burned the mattresses and pillows, while she took for herself the quilt and coverlets and all the hangings. Yet neither of them was well pleased. After this the funeral was made ready. Trustworthy men were sent with the body, and good horses which Thorod owned. The body was wrapped in linen, but not sewed up in it, and then laid in the coffin. After this they held south over the heath as the paths go, and went on until they came to a farm called Lower Ness, which lies in the tongues of Staff Holt. There they asked leave to stay overnight, but the farmer would give them no hospitality. However, as it was close on nightfall, they did not see how they could go on, for they thought it would be dangerous to deal with the White River by night. They therefore unloaded their horses and carried the body into an outhouse, after which they went into the sitting room and took off their outer clothes, intending to stay there overnight without food. The people of the house were going to bed by daylight, and after they were in bed a great noise was heard in the kitchen. Some went to see whether thieves had not broken in, and when they reached the kitchen they saw there a tall woman. She was quite naked, with no clothes whatever upon her, and was busy preparing food. Those who saw her were so terrified that they dared not go near her at all. When the funeral party heard of this, they went thither and saw what the matter was. Thorgunna had come there, and it seemed advisable to them all not to meddle with her. When she had done all that she wanted, she brought the food into the room, set the tables, and laid the food upon them. Then the funeral party said to the farmer, "It may happen in the end, before we part, that you will think it dearly bought that you would show us no hospitality." Both the farmer and the housewife answered, "We will willingly give you food, and do you all other services that you require." As soon as the farmer had offered them this, Thorgunna passed out of the room into the kitchen and then went outside, nor did she show herself again. Then a light was kindled in the room, and the wet clothes of the guests were taken off, and dry ones given them in their place. After this they sat down at the table and blessed their food, while the farmer had holy water sprinkled all over the house. The guests ate their food, and it harmed no man, although Thorgunna had prepared it. They slept there that night, and were treated with great hospitality. In the morning they continued their journey, and things went very smoothly with them. Wherever this affair was heard of, most people thought it best to do them all the service that they required, and of their journey no more is to be told. When they came to Skálholt, they handed over the precious things which Thorgunna had sent thither, the ring and other articles, all of which the priests gladly received. Thorgunna was buried there, while the funeral party returned home, which they all reached in safety. At Froda there was a large hall with a fireplace in the middle, and a bed-closet at the inner end of it, as was then the custom. At the outer end were 2 store-closets, one on each side. Dry fish were piled in one of these, and there was meal in the other. In this hall fires were kindled every evening, as was the custom, and folk sat round these fires for a long while before they went to supper. On that evening on which the funeral party came home, while the folk at Froda were sitting around the fires, they saw a half-moon appear on the panelling of the hall, and it was visible to all those who were present. It went round the room backwards and against the sun's course, nor did it disappear so long as they sat by the fires. Thorodd asked Thorir Woodenleg what this might portend. "It is the moon of fate," said Thorir, "and deaths will come after it." This went on all that week that the fate moon came in every evening. The next tidings that happened at Froda were that the shepherd came in and was very silent. He spoke little, and that in a frenzied manner. Folk were most inclined to believe that he had been bewitched, because he went about by himself and talked to himself. This went on for some time, but one evening, when 2 weeks of winter had passed, the shepherd came home, went to his bed, and lay down there. When they went to him in the morning he was dead, and was buried at the church. Soon after this there began great hauntings. One night Thorir Woodenleg went outside and was at some distance from the door. When he was about to go in again, he saw that the shepherd had come between him and the door. Thorir tried to get in, but the shepherd would not allow him. Then Thorir tried to get away from him, but the shepherd followed him, caught hold of him, and threw him down at the door. He received great hurt from this, but was able to reach his bed. There he turned black as coal, took sickness, and died. He was also buried at the church there, and after this both the shepherd and Thorir were seen in company, at which all the folk became full of fear, as was to be expected. This also followed upon the burial of Thorir, that one of Thorodd's men grew ill, and lay 3 nights before he died. Then one died after another, until 6 of them were gone. By this time, the Christmas fast had come, although the fast was not then kept in Iceland. The store closet in which the dried fish were kept was packed so full that the door could not be opened. The pile reached nigh up to the rafters, and a ladder was required to get the fish off the top of it. One evening, while the folk were sitting round the fires, the fish were torn, but when search was made, no living thing could be found there. During the winter, a little before Christmas, Thurgood went out to Ness for the fish he had there. There were 6 men in all in a 10-oared boat, and they stayed out there all night. The same evening that Thurgood went from home, it happened at Froda, when folk went to sit by the fires that had been made, that they saw a seal's head rise up out of the fireplace. A maid-servant was the first who came forward and saw this marvel. She took a washing-bat which lay beside the door, and struck the seal's head with this, but it rose up at the blow and gazed at Thorgunna's bed-hangings. Then one of the men went up and beat the seal, but it rose higher at every blow until it had come up above the fins. Then the man fell into a swoon, and all those who were present were filled with fear. Then the lad Jarton sprang forward, took up a large iron sledgehammer, and struck at the seal's head. It was a heavy blow, but it only shook its head and looked around. Then Jarton gave it stroke after stroke, and the seal went down as though he were driving in a stake. Jarton hammered away till the seal went down so far that he beat the floor close again above its head, and during the rest of the winter all the portents were most afraid of Jarton. Next morning, while Thurgood and the others were coming in from Ness with the fish, they were all lost out from any. The boat and the fish drove on shore there, but the bodies were never found. When the news of this reached Froda, Jarton and Thurgood invited their neighbors to the funeral banquet, and the ale prepared for Christmas was used for this purpose. The first evening of the feast, however, after the folk had taken their seats, there came into the hall Thurgood and his companions, all dripping wet. The folk greeted Thurgood well, thinking this a good omen, for at that time it was firmly believed that drowned men who came to their own funeral feast were well received by Ran, the sea goddess, and the old beliefs had as yet suffered little, though folk were baptized and called Christians. Thurgood and his fellows went right along the hall where the folk sat, and passed into the one where the fires were, answering no man's greeting. Those of the household who were in the hall ran out, and Thurgood and his men sat down beside the fires, where they remained till they had fallen into ashes. Then they went away again. This befell every evening while the banquet lasted, and there was much talk about it among those who were present. Some thought that it would stop when the feast was ended. When the banquet was over, the guests went home, leaving the place very dull and dismal. On the evening after they had gone, the fires were kindled as usual, and after they had burned up, there came in Thurgood with his company, all of them wet. They sat down by the fire and began to wring their clothes, and after they had sat down, there came in Thorir Woodenleg and his 5 companions, all covered with earth. They shook their clothes and scattered the earth on Thurgood and his fellows. The folk of the household rushed out of the hall, as might be expected, and all that evening they had no light nor any warmth from the fire. Next evening, the fires were made in the other hall, as the dead men would be less likely to come there. But this was not so, for everything happened just as it had done on the previous evening, and both parties came to sit by the fires. On the 3rd evening, Jarton advised that a large fire should be made in the hall, and a little fire in another and smaller room. This was done, and things then went on in this fashion, that Thurgood and the others sat beside the big fire, while the household contented themselves with the little one, and this lasted right through Christmastide. By this time there was more and more noise in the pile of fish, and the sound of them being torn was heard both by night and day. Some time after this it was necessary to take down some of the fish, and the man who went up on the pile saw the strange thing, that up out of the pile there came a tail, in appearance like a singed ox-tail. It was black and covered with hair like a seal. The man laid hold of it and pulled, and called on the others to come and help him. Others then got up on the heap, both men and women, and pulled at the tail, but all to no purpose. It seemed to them that the tail was dead, but while they tugged at it, it flew out of their hands, taking the skin off the palms of those who had been holding it the hardest, and no more was ever seen of the tail. The fish were then taken up, and every one was found to be torn out of the skin, yet no living thing was to be found in the pile. Following upon this, Thorgrima Charmcheek, the wife of Thorir Woodenleg, fell ill and lay only a little while before she died. And the same evening that she was buried, she was seen in company with her husband Thorir. The sickness then began a second time after the tale had been seen, and now the women died more than the men. Another 6 persons died in this attack, and some fled away on account of the ghosts and the hauntings. In the autumn there had been 30 in the household, of whom 18 were dead, and 5 had run away, leaving only 7 behind in the spring. When these marvels had reached this pitch, it happened one day that Jarten went to Helgafell to see his uncle Snorri, and asked his advice as to what should be done. There had then come to Helgafell a priest whom Gizur the White had sent to Snorri, and this priest Snorri sent to Froda along with Jarten, his son Thord, and 6 other men. He also gave them this advice, that they should burn all Thorgunna's bed hangings and hold a law court at the door, and there prosecute all those men who were walking after death. He also bade the priest hold service there, consecrate water, and confess the people. They summoned men from the nearest farms to accompany them, and arrived at Froda on the evening before Candlemas, just at the time when the fires were being kindled. Thurid the housewife had taken the sickness after the same fashion as those who had died. Jarten went in at once, and saw that Thorod and the others were sitting by the fire as usual. He took down Thorgunna's bed hangings, went into the hall, and carried out a live coal from the fire. Then all the bed gear that Thorgunna had owned was burned. After this, Jarten summoned Thorir Woodenleg, and Thord summoned Thorod, on the charge of going about the homestead without leave, and depriving men of both health and life. All those who sat beside the fire were summoned in the same way. Then a court was held at the door, in which the charges were declared, and everything done as in a regular law court. Opinions were given, the case summed up, and judgment passed. After sentence had been pronounced on Thorir Woodenleg, he rose up and said, "Now we have sat as long as we can bear." After this he went out by the other door from that at which the court was held. Then sentence was passed on the shepherd, and when he heard it, he stood up and said, "Now I shall go, and I think it would have been better before." When Thorgrima heard sentence pronounced on her, she rose up and said, "Now we have stayed while it could be borne." Then one after another was summoned, and each stood up as judgment was given upon him. All of them said something as they went out, and showed that they were loath to part. Finally, sentence was passed on Thorod himself, and when he heard it, he rose and said, "Little peace I find here, and let us all flee now," and went out after that. Then Jarton and the others entered, and the priest carried holy water and sacred relics all over the house. Later on in the day, he held solemn service, and after this all the hauntings and ghost walkings at Froda ceased, while Thurgood recovered from her sickness and became well again. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of the Book of Dreams and Ghosts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Book of Dreams and Ghosts by Andrew Lang. Chapter 14. Spiritualistic floating hands, hands in haunted houses, Jerome Cardan's tale, the cold hand, the beachcomber's tale, the black dogs and the thumbless hand, the Pakeha Maori, and the leper's hand, the hand of the ghost that bit. Hands all round. Nothing was more common in the seances of Home, the medium, than the appearance of spirit hands. If these were made of white kid gloves, stuffed, the idea at least was borrowed from ghost stories, in which ghostly hands with no visible bodies are not unusual. We see them in the Shop-Off case, at Rarick, and in other haunted houses. Here are some tales of hands, old or new. The Cold Hand. Jerome Cardan, the famous physician, tells the following anecdote in his De Rerum Varieté, Lib X 93. Jerome only once heard a rapping himself at the time of the death of a friend at a distance. He was in a terrible fright, and dared not leave his room all day. A story which my father used often to tell. I was brought up, he said, in the house of Joannes Resta, and therein taught Latin to his 3 sons. Where I left them, I supported myself on my own means. It chanced that one of these lads, while I was studying medicine, fell deadly sick, he being now a young man grown, and I was called in to be with the youth, partly for my knowledge of medicine, partly for old friendship's sake. The master of the house happened to be absent. The patient slept in an upper chamber, one of his brothers and I in a lower room. The third brother, Isidore, was not at home. Each of the rooms was next to a turret, turrets being common in that city. When we went to bed on the first night of my visit, I heard a constant knocking on the wall of the room. "What is that?" I said. "Don't be afraid. It is only a familiar spirit," said my companion. "They call them follets. It is harmless enough, and seldom so troublesome as it is now. I don't know what can be the matter with it." The young fellow went to sleep, but I was kept awake for a while, wondering and observing. After half an hour of stillness, I felt a thumb pressed on my head, and a sense of cold. I kept watching. The forefinger, the middle finger, and the rest of the hand were next laid on. The little finger nearly reached my forehead. The hand was like that of a boy of 10, to guess by the size, and so cold that it was extremely unpleasant. Meantime, I was chuckling over my luck in such an opportunity of witnessing a wonder, and I listened eagerly. The hand stole with the ring finger foremost over my face and down my nose. It was slipping into my mouth, and 2 fingertips had entered, when I threw it off with my right hand, thinking it was uncanny, and not relishing it inside my body. Silence followed, and I lay awake, distrusting the spectre more or less. In about half an hour it returned and repeated its former conduct, touching me very lightly, yet very chilly. When it reached my mouth, I again drove it away. Though my lips were tightly closed, I felt an extreme icy cold in my teeth. I now got out of bed, thinking this might be a friendly visit from the ghost of the sick lad upstairs who must have died. As I went to the door, the thing passed before me, rapping on the walls. When I was got to the door, it knocked outside. When I opened the door, it began to knock on the turret. The moon was shining. I went on to see what would happen, but it beat on the other sides of the tower, and as it always evaded me, I went up to see how my patient was. He was alive, but very weak. As I was speaking to those who stood about his bed, we heard a noise as if the house was falling. In rushed my bedfellow, the brother of the sick lad, half dead with terror. "When you got up," he said, "I felt a cold hand on my back. I thought it was you who wanted to waken me and take me to see my brother. So I pretended to be asleep and lay quiet. supposing that you would go alone when you found me so sound asleep. But when I did not feel you get up, and the cold hand grew to be more than I could bear, I hid out to push your hand away and felt your place empty but warm. Then I remembered the fallet, and ran upstairs as hard as I could, put my feet to the ground. Never was I in such a fright. The sick lad died on the following night. Here Carden the elder stopped, and Jerome his son philosophized on the subject. Miss Dindy, on the authority of Mr. Elijah Cope, an itinerant preacher, gives this anecdote of similar familiarity with a fallet in Staffordshire. Fairies! I went into a farmhouse to stay a night, and in the evening there came a knocking in the room, as if someone had struck the table. I jumped up. My hostess got up, and, "Good night," says she, "I'm off." "But what was it?" said I. "Just a poor old fairy," says she. "Old Nancy, she's a poor old thing, been here ever so long, lost her husband and her children. It's bad to be left like that all alone. I leave a bit of cake on the table for her, and sometimes she fetches it, and sometimes she don't." The Black Dog and the Thumbless Hand. Some years ago I published in a volume of tales called The Wrong Paradise a paper styled My Friend the Beachcomber. This contained genuine adventures of a kinsman, my oldest and most intimate friend, who had passed much of his life in the Pacific, mainly in a foreign colony, and in the wild New Hebrides. My friend is a man of education, an artist, and a student of anthropology and ethnology. Engaged on a work of scientific research, he has not committed any of his innumerable adventures, warlike or wandering, to print. The following yarn he sent to me lately in a letter on some points of native customs. Of course, the description of the beachcomber in the book referred to is purely fictitious. The yarn of the thumbless hand is here cast in a dialogue, but the whole of the strange experience described is given in the words of a narrator. It should be added that, though my friend was present at some amateur seances in a remote isle of the sea, he is not a spiritualist, never was one, and has no theory to account for what occurred, and no belief in spooks of any description. His faith is plighted to the theories of Mr. Darwin, and that is his only superstition. The name of the principal character in the yarn is, of course, fictitious. The real name is an old but not a noble one in England. "Have the natives the custom of walking through fire?" said my friend the beachcomber in answer to a question of mine. "Not that I know of. In fact, the soles of their feet are so thick-skinned they would think nothing of it." "Then have they any spiritualistic games like the Burmans and Maoris? I have a lot of yarns about them." "They are too jolly well frightened of bush spirits to invite them to tea," said the beachcomber. "I knew a fellow who got a bit of land merely by whistling up and down in it at nightfall. They think spirits whistle. No, I don't fancy they go in for seances, but we once had some, we white men, in one of the islands. Not the wee-wees," native name for the French. "Real white men, and that led to Bolter's row with me." "What about?" "Oh, about his young woman. I told her the story. It was thoughtless, and yet I don't know that I was wrong. After all, Bolter could not have been a comfortable fellow to marry." In this opinion, readers of the Beachcomber's narrative will probably agree, I fancy. "Bad moral character?" "Not that I know of. Queer fish. Kept queer company. Even if she was ever so fond of dogs. I don't think a girl would have cared for Bolter's kennel. Not in a bedroom, anyway." "But she surely could have got him to keep them outside, however doggy he was." "He was not doggy a bit. I don't know that Bolter ever saw the black dogs himself. He certainly never told me so. It is that beastly thumbless hand. No woman could have stood it, not to mention the chance of catching cold when it pulled the blankets off." "What on earth are you talking about? I can understand a man attended by black dogs that nobody sees but himself. The Catholics tell it of John Knox, and of another reformer, a fellow called Smeaton. Moreover, it is common in delirium tremens. But you say Bolter didn't see the dogs?" "No, not so far as he told me. But I did, and other fellows, when with Bolter. Bolter was asleep, he didn't see anything. Also the hand, which was a good deal worse. I don't know if he ever saw it, but he was jolly nervous, and he had heard of it." The habits of the beachcomber are absolutely temperate. Otherwise my astonishment would have been less, and I should have regarded all these phenomena as subjective. "Tell me about it all, old cock," I said. "I'm sure I told you last time I was at home." "Never. My memory for yarns is only too good. I hate a chestnut." Well, here goes. Mind you, I don't profess to explain the thing, only I don't think I did wrong in telling the young woman, for however you account for it, it was not nice. A good many years ago there came to the island as a clerk un nommé Bolter, English or Jew. His name's not Jewish. No, and I really don't know about his breed. The most curious thing about his appearance was his eyes. They were large, black, and had a peculiar, dull, dead luster. Did they shine in the dark? I knew a fellow at Oxford whose eyes did. Chairs ran after him. I never noticed. I don't remember. Psychically, as you superstitious muffs call it, Bolter was still more queer. At that time we were all gone on spirit rapping. Bolter turned out a great acquisition, medium, or whatnot. Mind you, I'm not saying Bolter was straight. In the dark he'd tell you what you had in your hand, exact time of your watch, and so on. I didn't take stock in this, and one night brought some photographs with me, and asked for a description of them. This he gave correctly, winding up by saying, "The one nearest your body is that of..." Here my friend named a person well known to both of us, whose name I prefer not to introduce here. This person, I may add, had never been in or near the island and was totally unknown to Bolter. Of course, my friend went on, the photographs were all the time inside my pocket. Now, really, Bolter had some mystic power of seeing in the dark. "Hyperesthesia," said I. "Hypocriticism," said the beachcomber. "What happened next might be hyperesthesia. I suppose you mean abnormal intensity of the senses. But how could hyperesthesia see through a tweed coat and lining?" "Well, what happened next?" "Bolter's firm used to get sheep by every mail from blank, and send them regularly to their station, 6 miles off. One time they landed late in the afternoon, and yet were foolishly sent off, Bolter in charge. I said at the time he would lose half the lot, as it would be dark long before we could reach the station. He didn't lose them. Next day I met one of the niggers who had sent to lend him a hand and asked the results. "Master," said the nigger, "Bolter is a devil he sees at night. When the sheep ran away to right or left in the dark, he told us where to follow." "He heard them, I suppose," said I. "Maybe, but you must be sharp to have sharper senses than these niggers. Anyhow, that was not Bolter's account of it. When I saw him and spoke to him, he said simply, yes, that when excited or interested to seek or find anything in obscurity, the object became covered with a dim glow of light which rendered it visible." "But things in a pocket, that also," said he. "Curious, isn't it? Probably the Rontgen rays are implicated therein, eh?" "Did you ever read Dr. Gregory's Letters on Animal Magnetism?" "The cove that invented Gregory's mixture? Yes. Beast he must have been. No, never read him." "He says that Major Buckley's hypnotized subjects saw hidden objects in a blue light. Mottos inside a nut, for example. Rontgen rays for a $5, but Bolter said nothing about seeing blue light. Well, after 3 or 4 seances, Bolter used to be very nervous and unwilling to sleep alone, so I once went with him to his one-roomed hut. We turned into the same bed. I was awakened later by a noise and movement in the room. Found the door open, the full moon streaming in, making light like day, and the place full of great big black dogs. Well, anyhow, there were 4 or 5. They were romping about, seemingly playing. One jumped on the bed, another rubbed his muzzle on mine. The bed was low, and I slept outside. Now, I never had anything but love for dogs of any kind, and as, n'est-ce pas, love casts out fear, I simply got up, turned them all out, shut the door, and turned in again myself. Of course, my idea was that they were flesh and blood, and I allude to physical fear. I slept, but was anew awakened by a ghastly feeling that the blanket was being dragged and creeping off the bed. I pulled it up again, but anew began the slow movement of descent. Rather surprised, I pulled it up afresh and held it, and must have dozed off, as I suppose. Awoke to feel it being pulled again. It was slipping, and then, with a sudden violent jerk, it was thrown on the floor. Il faut dire that during all this I had glanced several times at Bolter, who seemed profoundly asleep. But now alarmed, I tried to wake him. In vain, he slept like the dead, his face always a pasty white, now like marble in the moonlight. After some hesitation, I put the blanket back on the bed and held it fast. The pulling at once began, and increased in strength, and I, by this time thoroughly alarmed, put all my strength against it, and hung on like grim death. To get a better hold, I had taken a turn over my head, or perhaps simply to hide, when suddenly I felt a pressure outside on my body, and a movement like fingers. They gradually approached my head. Mad with fear, I chucked off the blanket, grabbed a hand, gazed on it for one moment in silent horror, and threw it away. No wonder it was attached to no arm or body. It was hairy and dark-coloured. The fingers were short, blunt, with long claw-like nails, and it was minus a thumb. Too frightened to get up, I had to stop in bed, and I suppose fell to sleep again, after fresh vain attempts to awaken Bolter. Next morning I told him about it. He said several men who had thus passed the night with him had seen this hand. "But," added he, "it's lucky you didn't have the big black dogs also." Tableau. I was to have slept again with him next night to look further into the matter, but a friend of his came from that day, so I could not renew the experiment as I had fully determined to do. By the by, I was troubled for months after by the same feeling that the clothes were being pulled off the bed. And thus the yarn of the black dogs and the thumbless hand. "I think," said I, "that you did no harm in telling Bolter's young woman. I never thought of it when I told her, or of her interest in the kennel, but by George, she soon broke off her engagement." "Do you know Manning, the Pakeha Maori, the fellow who wrote Old New Zealand?" "No, what about him?" "He did not put it in his book, but he told the same yarn, without the dogs, as having happened to himself. He saw the whole arm, and the hand was leprous." "Ugh," said the beachcomber. Next morning he was obliged to view the body of an old Maori who had been murdered in his garden the night before. That old man's hand was the hand he saw. I know a room in an old house in England where plucking off the bedclothes goes on every now and then, and has gone on as long as the present occupants have been there. But I only heard lately, and they only heard from me, that the same thing used to occur in the same room and no other in the last generation, when another family lived there. Anybody see anything?" "No, only footsteps are heard creeping up, before the twitches come off." "And what do the people do?" "Nothing. We set a camera once to photograph the spook. He did not sit." "It's rum," said the beachcomber. "But mind you, as to spooks, I don't believe a word of it." The Ghost That Bit. The idiot Scotch laird in the story would not let the dentist put his fingers in his mouth. "For I'm feared you'll bite me." The following anecdote proves that a ghost may entertain a better founded alarm on this score. A correspondent of Notes and Queries, 3rd September 1864, is responsible for the narrative, given almost verbatim from the lips of the lady herself, a person of tried veracity. Emma S., one of several children, was sleeping alone with her face toward the west, a large house near C, in the Staffordshire moorlands. As she had given orders to her maid to call her at an early hour, she was not surprised at being awakened between 3 and 4 on a fine August morning in 1840 by a sharp tapping at her door, when in spite of a "thank you, I hear" to the first and second raps, with the third came a rush of wind, which caused the curtains to be drawn up in the center of the bed. She became annoyed, and sitting up, called out, "Marie, what are you about?" Instead, however, of her servant, she was astonished to see the face of an aunt by marriage peering above and between the curtains, and at the same moment, whether unconsciously she threw forward her arms, or whether they were drawn forward, as it were, in a vortex of air, she cannot be sure. One of her thumbs was sensibly pressed between the teeth of the apparition, though no mark afterwards remained on it. All this notwithstanding, she remained collected and unalarmed, but instantly arose, dressed, and went downstairs, where she found not a creature stirring. Her father, on coming down shortly afterwards, naturally asked what had made her rise so early, rallied her on the cause, and soon afterwards went on to his sister-in-law's house, where he found that she had just unexpectedly died. Coming back again, and not noticing his daughter's presence in the room, in consequence of her being behind a screen near the fire, he suddenly announced the event to his wife, as being of so remarkable a character that he could in no way account for it. As may be anticipated, Emma, overhearing this unlooked-for denouement of her dream, at once fell to the ground in a fainting condition. On one of the thumbs of the corpse was found a mark as if it had been bitten in death agony. We have now followed the ghostly from its germs and dreams and momentary hallucinations of eye or ear up to the most prodigious narratives which popular invention has built on bases probably very slight, where facts and experience, whether real or hallucinatory experience, end, where the myopic fancy comes in, readers may decide for themselves. End of Chapter 14. End of the Book of Dreams and Ghosts by Andrew Lang.